The Harry Potter franchise is one of my favorite movie franchises of all time. Growing up, I was immersed in the wizarding world and all the many complex and likable characters found throughout the series. However, three movies did stick out to me from the rest: Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban, Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire, and Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix. Recently, I took some time to rewatch these movies, and I noticed that they were a lot more connected. Not only is there a strong character arc for the protagonist and overarching themes, but also plot threads, villains, and side characters that work to serve both the protagonist's growth and the themes within. I also noticed how Prisoner served as kind of like an introductory film, how Goblet served as a sequel, and how Order served as a closing film. With all this in mind, I noticed that these three movies work not only in the midst of a franchise, but as their own separate trilogy. Now, I know what y'all are thinking. How could these movies work as a trilogy, especially since the first movie in this so called trilogy is the third movie in the franchise? Well, stay with me for the next few minutes and you may start to see something that I'm seeing. First, we should take a look at Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban and what it does to open up this trilogy. But in order to do that, we should take a look at what makes a good opening to a trilogy. And what better way to do that than by looking at what other great trilogies did in the past? Firstly, movies like Batman Begins from the Dark Knight trilogy and Toy Story from the Toy Story trilogy introduce the protagonist and the growth that they will undertake over the course of the movie. Both movies emphasize Bruce Wayne's and Woody's flaws and them learning a valuable skill by the end of the movie. Secondly, first movies and trilogies also not only introduce us to the world, but the many characters, sidekicks and villains alike, that will influence the protagonist's decisions and changes over the course of the trilogy. This is shown in movies like The Fellowship of the Ring from the Lord of the Rings trilogy and Star Wars A New Hope from the original Star Wars trilogy. In those movies, we are introduced to the worlds of Middle Earth and Star Wars and meet many characters that will stick with us throughout the series and see how they will influence Frodo's and Luke's changes in decisions. Finally, first movies and trilogies usually end on a positive note with a win for the heroes, but like a small loose plot thread or cliffhanger that is left to be explored for the next movie. This is shown through movies like Rise of the Planet of the Apes from the new Planet of the Apes trilogy, Batman Begins from the Dark Knight trilogy, and Star Wars A New Hope from the original Star Wars trilogy. In Star Wars, the rebels are able to destroy the Death Star, and Luke, Han, and Chewie all receive medals. However, we know that Darth Vader escaped. In Rise of the Planet of the Apes, Caesar is able to escape with his new family of apes to Muir Woods, but we discover that James Franco's neighbor is a pilot and is spreading the virus from the movie. Finally, in Batman Begins, Batman is able to defeat Ra's al Ghul and become the hero in Gotham. But we discover from Gordon that a new criminal is in town who leaves the Joker playing card as his calling card. Based on all these criteria, an introductory movie in a trilogy must introduce a likable protagonist who will learn a lesson by the end, introduce a world to be invested in, introduce many new characters that will influence the protagonist, and usually will end on a good note with an unfinished plot thread. With all this in mind, we should be ready to. Wait. I knew I was forgetting something. How could we explore the third movie in such a well connected franchise as Harry Potter without exploring the idea of how it could be the first movie in a trilogy? Now, the first thing to understand before we go into this is that Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban is a very unique movie when compared to the rest of the movies in the series, in that it can actually stand on its own. Many other people on the internet have talked about this, including the video essay channel Movie Flame, in the video titled The Prisoner of Azkaban, a Cinematic Masterpiece. In the video, the creator, Morgan Ross, talks about Alfonso Cuarón, the director, saying one thing he did really well was make this movie be able to stand on its own, something that the other films could not do. If you watch the rest of the movies without seeing the rest of the series, you'll be lost. But here, part of his filmmaking style was make it be able to stand on its own, and that's one of the reasons why it stands out so much in this series. So why is this important when seeing this as an opening to a trilogy? Well, the fact that it can stand on its own makes it the only movie in the series, besides the first, to use as a starting point for something like a trilogy. Just a quick disclaimer though before we start, we are only going to be talking about the Harry Potter movies when discussing the possibility of this trilogy. The books, unfortunately in my opinion, just don't work with this idea. The books being more detailed, being written by one author who's trying to create a franchise, the idea of Prisoner of Azkaban working as a starting point doesn't really work within those confines. The Prisoner of Azkaban book relies on you having read the other ones and tend to jump right into the action, while the movie tries to slowly introduce you to the protagonist, world, the side characters, and all the elements. This slow introduction causes the movie to seem a lot more like an opening in the series. Pretty much most of that is attributed to Quaron, like I mentioned before. The same goes when talking about Order of the Phoenix. With this movie trilogy focusing on Harry's growth, something I'll really get into later, the Order of the Phoenix movie tries to tie everything together with an emotional finale and lesson, while the book tends to take more time to set up the stakes for the next few books by talking about the upcoming war and changes in the wizarding world. Now, with that out of the way, let's explore Harry Potter and the Prisoner of Azkaban. The first few opening scenes are very important, as they must set up the protagonist, world, theme, characters, and conflict at hand. Prisoner does that amazingly. Seeing this movie as if it was the first Harry Potter you've seen, we open up on a young boy who's doing magic, but trying to hide it from an older man. It has already been established this boy knows magic, and this man, who we learn a few seconds later takes care of him, disapproves of magic. We then have a small scene of Harry asking Vernon to sign something for his school, which foreshadows a later event in the film. However, the elephant in the room is the scene of Aunt Marge's arrival. This scene tells us a lot about Harry. We learn his backstory of how he was an orphan, his parents died, how he is treated poorly by everyone around him, whereas Dudley is seen as an angel. But most importantly, we learn one of Harry's major flaws, his inability to control his emotions as he gets angry with Marge and even blows her up into a balloon. As for the history, it not only tells us who Harry is in an entertaining manner, but also gives us insight to his other flaw, his negative thinking and lack of hope. We see that he has had a horrendous past and upbringing, so it seems understandable that he doesn't usually have positive thinking and ability to think of happy memories. Now, I know many people don't like the scene where Harry is using magic to do work from school, as it just breaks the idea that underage wizards aren't allowed to use magic outside of school. And yes, normally I do agree when looking at this scene in the context of the rest of these movies. But since the director was making this as if it were a standalone film, the scene actually works to show Harry as a wizard. If you didn't have this scene, and then all of a sudden Harry makes Marge blow up like a balloon, the audience would see Harry as some psycho mutant discovering his powers. Granted, do I think they could have showed him being a wizard without breaking the law? Yes, you could have just showed him reading and then glancing at his wand, and then Vernon coming in to tell him to put it away. Anyways, Marge blowing up. So yeah, it shows Harry's flaw of controlling his emotions. This is one of the many lessons he learns over the course of the trilogy. The scene after that has Harry acting rash, showing another one of his flaws as he leaves the house and then sees a black dog, which sparks uneasiness with Harry and the audience for the rest of the movie. So far, we have introduced our protagonist, and the movie has done its best to make him as relatable as possible. As described by the book Into the Woods, How Stories Work and Why We Tell Them by John York, quote, what an archetypal story does is introduce you to a central character, the protagonist, and invite you to identify with them. Effectively, they become your avatar in the drama. You live the experience of the story vicariously through them. When they're in jeopardy, you're in jeopardy. When they're ecstatic, you are too. Prisoner of Azkaban does this by making you not only feel for the main character, but understand him, as he'll be the character you will be spending most time with in this movie and others to come. It is important to set Harry up as someone the audience can identify with. You must give them flaws, like his ability to lose control and see only negatives in a situation, so that you can understand the character better. The problem I always had with other movies in the series, particularly Sorcerer's Stone and Chamber of Secrets, was that they always made Harry a bit bland. Like, sure, the audience definitely felt for him, like when he was bullied by the Dursleys, but to me, the character had no flaws. He was perfect, and that honestly bored me. He was actually one of my least favorite characters when I was growing up. However, when I sat down to just watch these three movies, he became one of my favorites, as he was given flaws, actual problems with his character that others could understand and relate to. Anyway, we've already established a bit of history and some flaws of the protagonist. Now we need to establish the world, and what better way to do that than with the night bus scene? This scene establishes the magic behind this world and how it is right in front of the noses of Muggles. Even in the bus, Harry and Stan talk about Muggles, which helps us understand what Muggles are. We also find out about who Sirius Black is and the threat he faces. This will establish one of the upcoming conflicts in the movie. They also mention someone named You-Know-Who will play a much larger role in the future. Next, we transition to Harry's conversation with Fudge. There, we learn that Fudge is Minister for Magic, that Harry is famous, and that Fudge might be hiding something about Sirius Black's interest in Harry. After that, we have the scene with the Monster Book of Monsters, which establishes both the small danger aspects of the wizarding world, as well as Harry's trait of being clever. After establishing the protagonist, world, and hinting at the conflict, we finally start getting some introductions to other characters who will play a large role in Harry's life. Ron and Hermione. The Ron and Hermione relationship plays a fairly big role about Harry's mindset. In pretty much each of these three films we will be exploring, Ron and Hermione always seem closer with each other than with Harry. There are many small hints of this, but the overall purpose is to separate Harry from both the wizarding world and people in general, making him feel lonelier than he actually is, which is something that's explored in these movies, and especially Order of the Phoenix. Anyway, we get our first introduction to them where they are arguing about their pets. Throughout most of these films, Ron and Hermione always argue about something, whether it be their pets in Prisoner of Azkaban or the Yule Ball and Victor Crumb in Goblet of Fire. This is important as the things they argue about are relatively small and stupid, making their conflicts seem insignificant compared to what Harry has to deal with. Due to this, they pretty much always take a backseat to the conflict at hand and are shown as much more of a comparison between Harry's life and Ron and Hermione's. Honestly, this becomes one of the major problems with Half-Blood Prince, as it focuses more on relationships, something that was always kept as a secondary issue in past movies. But anyway, that's a discussion for a whole other day. So Harry meets Ron and Hermione. They're arguing, and they just barely notice him. We then get a bit of information about Ron's family, who also plays a large role in these movies, as we see Ron showing the paper that his family went to Egypt, adding to his personality of wanting to become famous, which becomes important in the next movie as he gets jealous of Harry entering the Triwizard Tournament without telling him. We meet Fred and George, who are seen as jokesters, Molly, who cares for Harry, and finally Arthur, who also cares about Harry. This scene of character introductions also manages to transition to an introduction of one of the two conflicts in the movie where Arthur tells Harry about Sirius Black coming after him. After the scene concludes, all we need now is the second conflict and an introduction to the villain of the movie. And the movie delivers by showing us Harry's problem with the Dementors. When he gets on the train, we first of all see another small nod to Ron and Hermione's closeness as they sit with each other on the train. But then the Dementor enters and only affects Harry, making him feel more isolated and introducing Harry's other conflict in the movie. Why does he have problems with Dementors, and if he can do anything to prevent this from happening to him? Now, we have finally established all the important introductory elements of the movie, with the protagonist, important side characters with Ron and Hermione, villain with the Dementors, the Wizarding World, and finally the two conflicts with Sirius Black and the Dementors. The rest of the movie goes along with some more character introductions, escalation of conflicts, and a rising theme and lesson to learn for the protagonist. First, with character introductions, we have Malfoy. Malfoy plays a very small role in these three movies, especially when compared to larger roles such as Sorcerer's Stone, Chamber of Secrets, and Half-Blood Prince. He is only introduced as a bully, and that is all the knowledge we need about him for now. We also get Hagrid, who we see as a friend to Harry, Ron, and Hermione. Finally, we get Dumbledore and Lupin, and Sirius later on, which serve as sort of mentor figures to Harry and help him in learning important lessons in this movie and other movies to come. As the movie goes along, almost every situation that is shown coincides with the theme of hope and tests Harry where he is given the ability to learn lessons. After the Dementor on the train, Dumbledore gives a speech basically telling Harry about finding light in dark times. After that, the movie takes turns exposing Harry to a dark situation and then the happiness he can find from the things around him. This is shown with the small scene of Harry and friends having fun in the dormitory while dark Dementors are outside their windows. Then, when he is exposed to a divination class, where Trelawney thinks he will die and he is reminded of that black dog from the beginning. But, followed up immediately with the Care of Magical Creatures class, where he meets and flies Buckbeak through the castle grounds. I actually really like the line Ron says in Divination about Harry, saying, "You're gonna suffer, but you're gonna be happy about it." I think it sums up Harry's life completely, as he deals with so many difficult situations, but ends up happy after it all happens due to a realization of everything he has. After, Harry finds out that Sirius Black is coming closer to Hogwarts, more darkness, followed up by a Defense Against the Dark Arts class, where Lupin teaches Harry and others how to defeat a boggart, which is through joy and laughter. After that, he isn't allowed to go to Hogsmeade and is left alone, but ends up having a conversation with Lupin about his parents. Eventually, this leads up to the Quidditch match, where Harry is exposed once again to the Dementors and takes action against one of the conflicts in the movie as he asks Lupin to train how to defeat them. Harry is finally getting into a good spot in the movie, where he sneaks off to Hogsmeade and has fun with his friends, all until he learns that Sirius is his godfather, was friends with his parents, but also betrayed them. This hits Harry hard and causes him to lose control by becoming angry and want to kill Sirius. This addresses one of Harry's flaws from the beginning, losing control. As the movie progresses, he continues to learn to control himself and find hope. He learns how to produce a Patronus with the help of Lupin, and he learns the truth about Sirius. In the Shrieking Shack, we learn that Sirius was never bad and actually gives Harry hope by asking him to live with him. However, as usual, things go wrong. Lupin turns into a werewolf, Pettigrew escapes, and Sirius is captured. Once again, Harry is not in a good spot. So, Dumbledore helps out and gives Harry and Hermione the opportunity to go back in time to save Sirius and Buckbeak. When using the time turner with Hermione, she instructs him on the value of being careful and controlling himself. This is eventually shown where he wants to expose himself and capture Pettigrew when he escaped, but is prevented by Hermione. Harry begins to understand to control himself. Harry is then able to act smartly and save Sirius and his past self by channeling all his positivity and casting a Patronus on the horde of Dementors, defeating the villain of the movie. Harry's final conversation with Sirius leaves Harry on a positive note as he reassures Harry that he can always find those he cares about in his heart. With that, our protagonist has learned 2 valuable lessons with the help of the people around him. The story should be complete. However, we are forgetting one thing that initial movies in a trilogy do: get us ready for the next movie by leaving a plot thread hanging. And in Prisoner of Azkaban, it is the escape of Pettigrew, foreshadowed with the prophecy by Trelawney earlier in the movie. This small plot thread is something that will have to be addressed in future movies, but isn't like a major cliffhanger. Instead, the movie ends still with our protagonist as he receives a gift from Sirius and a new broom for the one that broke, a last bit of positivity. With that, we have concluded our first movie in a trilogy, with the next one being Goblet of Fire. But in order to continue, we should take a look at what a good sequel in the trilogy does. Firstly, it must build on the world and characters. This is usually done by adding new places or new characters to interact with the protagonist and existing characters. This is shown in movies like Empire Strikes Back in the original Star Wars trilogy and The Two Towers in the Lord of the Rings trilogy. In Empire, the characters travel to different places like Hoth and Dagobah, and meet new characters like Lando and Yoda. While in the Two Towers, we travel to different places like Rohan and meet new characters like Gollum, King Theoden. Additionally, sequels tend to skip introductions of the protagonists and characters we already know, rather going straight into the action. This is shown in movies like The Dark Knight from the Dark Knight trilogy and Back to the Future 2 from the Back to the Future trilogy. In The Dark Knight, we are thrust right into the action of the Joker's heist, and we immediately see after Batman and Gordon discussing the heist together. In Back to the Future 2, we immediately skip the introductions as Marty and Doc are already on their way to the future and Marty is given a task to do. Finally, the sequel is usually a lot darker and ends on a somber note for the protagonist, and many times even a cliffhanger-like ending. This usually raises the stakes for the final showdown in the last movie. This is shown in movies like The Dark Knight from the Dark Knight trilogy and Empire Strikes Back in the original Star Wars trilogy. In The Dark Knight, Bruce has to flee Gotham after the incident with Harvey Dent, while in Empire, the movie ends with many rebels scattered and Luke and Leia having lost Han. Many pieces of criteria in mind, we should be ready to explore Goblet of Fire. The movie starts by thrusting the audience into a dark yet confusing setting. We are put right into the action of the movie, where we are given hints as to the main conflict. The Dark Lord Voldemort is planning something with the aid of Pettigrew from the last movie, and he needs Harry for it. This scene not only sets up the tone and upcoming conflict of the movie, but also the theme of trust. Actually, what I really like about this movie is that it is basically a mystery thriller, where both Harry and the audience are constantly trying to answer many questions presented throughout the movie, as well as figure out which characters can be trusted. This introduction sets this up perfectly by having the audience already start asking questions about who the man is and what Voldemort is planning. After that, we immediately transition to Harry, who we see saw all of this as a dream, as well as Ron and Hermione as they're getting ready to go to something. A few seconds later, we have the 3 of them walking with Arthur, Fred, George, and Ginny. So far, this movie has wasted no time introducing these characters who we should know from the last movie. Instead, it goes straight into the action with both the opening scene and now our protagonist and friends immediately leaving somewhere. I actually really like how they chose to cut the Dursleys and go straight into the events of the movie. Anyways, after that, in order to engage viewers and remind them why they love Harry Potter, the movie takes time to expand the world with both the Portkey and Quidditch World Cup. The Portkey is particularly clever due to it coming up again towards the end of the movie. The Quidditch World Cup reminds us as to the magic and wonder of Harry Potter that wasn't as really largely touched upon in Prisoner of Azkaban. Like when Harry enters the tent and says, "I love magic." I know I was thinking the same. However, the movie doesn't just put this in to show the world. Just like the night bus, this scene introduces us to many characters and plot elements that will come up later, whether it be Amos, Cedric Diggory, the Porky, which I mentioned earlier, Lucius Malfoy, who at this point in the trilogy hasn't been seen yet, only mentioned really in Prisoner, Death Eaters, Harry's scar herding, the Dark Mark, and finally Crouch and Crumb. Crumb's introduction here, rather than showing up at school, is especially important as it emphasizes his fame, so when later Hermione goes to the Yule Ball with him, it is seen as a big deal. As for Crouch, he is introduced as this important ministry official that if he was just randomly mentioned later at Hogwarts, when all these other characters were already being introduced, it would have been way too much to remember, and we wouldn't have actually learned anything about his personality. And yes, I know that many people don't like that they cut out the Quidditch match. But for me, it was actually a good change, as the match wouldn't have shown anything to audience. Every other scene at the match sets up important elements. This wouldn't have done that. Plus, we already got 4 other major spectacles in this movie. We really do not need another one. We then have Harry and friends on the train to Hogwarts, and many small things happen. First off, we have another small nod to Ron and Hermione's closeness, with them sitting together on the train. Then there's the scene of how Ron can't afford to buy some candy, which adds a bit to his character and is later important when he has anger and jealousy towards Harry. Then there is Harry staring at Cho Chang, which both introduces her as a love interest for Harry in this movie and the next one. And finally, there's the conversation between the 3 friends on the train about how the event at the Cup was a major deal, and how many ministry officials were upset that it happened right under them, which emphasizes the theme of the movie: trust. This is further shown with how Harry is reluctant to say anything about his scar and dreamed Sirius. Just like in Prisoner of Azkaban, the theme is the same as the lesson Harry has to learn. Harry has to learn to trust in those around him. With our next scene, we get another batch of new characters with Karkaroff, Maxime, Fleur, and most notably, Moody. It also introduces the Triwizard Tournament and the Goblet of Fire, the 2 things that the plot and conflict are mostly going to surround. Anyways, the next is my personal favorite scene in the movie, so I really want to talk about it. The scene with Moody teaching the unforgivable curses. It teaches us a lot about his character, showing his intensity, making the scene very tense, as well as introducing us to 3 curses. Our movie has now introduced us to a plethora of characters, as well as some new elements in the Wizarding world. Actually, this movie introduces more new places and characters than any other movie in the series. Many reviewers actually commented how there was so much to talk about, saying, quote, "This movie greatly expands the Harry Potter universe, with new characters, places, traditions, and spells," end quote. Personally, I think this is most important in creating a sequel, as you want to intrigue audiences a second time, all reminding them why they fell in love and came back to this universe in the first place. Now the movie has to go back to the formula of creating a conflict and struggle for a protagonist, have the protagonist learn a lesson with the theme of trust, and play out the mystery element which comes up of who puts Harry's name in the Goblet of Fire. Trust is also especially important due to the many dark events that happened earlier in the movie, such as the Dark Mark, Death Eaters, Harry's dream, and now Harry being put into this dangerous tournament. The dangers of all these events actually becomes apparent to many of the mentor-like characters to Harry, such as Sirius and Dumbledore. Sirius immediately suspects something and tells Harry to be cautious of certain people, like Karkaroff and Crouch. Meanwhile, Dumbledore plays things smart by letting the events unfold in order to gain any sense out of them. The mystery element of the movie works really well with the presented theme of trust and the judgments made by many characters. It also works to challenge Harry's notion of trust, as at first, no one believes him that he didn't put his name in the goblet, and that he is a cheater who is really looking for fame. This is emphasized with the Potter Stinks badges, the introduction of Rita Skeeter, who writes a bogus news article about him, and most importantly, the distrust of some of those closest to him, most notably Ron. Causes Harry to be very lonely and feed into the mindset of having to go at everything alone, especially the challenges, which is very dangerous. However, just like in the last movie, Harry has other people to help him learn this lesson and get through the dangerous conflict of the Triwizard Tournament. Harry has a notable conversation with Sirius, which tells him to be cautious of all the people around him, but still keep his friends close. As the first task approaches, Harry eventually has help from Hagrid and technically Ron that the task is about dragons. Meanwhile, Hermione and Moody help him to figure out a way to beat the dragon. Now, Moody is an interesting character as he becomes Harry's new mentor figure in this movie, even though he's faking being a good person the whole time. As stated before, with Harry being the protagonist, we tend to live through the world within his perspective, and since he learns to trust Moody, so do we. The biggest scene that actually causes both Harry and we, the audience, to trust him comes when he turns Malfoy into a ferret. We know that Malfoy is a big bully to Harry, so when he punishes him, it causes us to trust him even more. On top of that, he helps Harry throughout the tournament, gaining more trust in us. Harry learns to rely on Moody, and he becomes the new mentor figure that Lupin was in the last movie. But mentor figures aren't the only people that Harry needs around him. After the first task, he gains the support of many of his house members, including Ron, who apologizes to him. But now, another conflict that tests Harry's trust rears its ugly head: the Yule Ball. Now, this is an interesting addition to the story, as it isn't a dangerous event, but still tests Harry on his social skills with others. As he says to Ron, I'll take the dragon right now. The Triwizard Tournament was already a great idea in testing Harry's wits and trust in others. The Yule Ball also slows down the story and gives time to expand on other characters besides Harry. The most obvious example is Ron and Hermione's quarrels. However, we also get more information about Hagrid and his life as a half-giant, as well as Cho Chang, who Harry likes but goes to the ball with Cedric. After the ball, the second task comes, and once again, Harry has help to prepare from Cedric and even Neville. Meanwhile, in the task, Harry is determined to save everyone from the Black Lake, and actually gets rewarded with second place due to it. At this point in the movie, Harry is doing well in the tournament and actually learning to trust others. However, his happiness is cut short by finding Crouch dead in the forest. This causes him to go to Dumbledore and actually get some answers to some of the questions in the movie, such as about the dream from the beginning, and who was that man with Voldemort. We learn who the man is, but not the meaning of the dream or how he was with Voldemort when Dumbledore said he was in Azkaban. With the movie reaching its climax, more questions are being set up. This also comes with Harry's meeting with Snape, as he sees Karkaroff worried about his mark, and Snape accusing Harry of creating a Polyjuice potion. And yes, if this were a trilogy, how would we know what Polyjuice potion is? It was only really in Chamber of Secrets, and yes, for this I have very little explanation, but what if we aren't supposed to know at all? What if Snape accuses Harry of something that both him and us don't know about? I think that's still possible. Anyways, we reach the third task, and there are a lot more unanswered questions than before. But first, Harry has to deal with what looks like the most dangerous task, as it is very psychological. As he races for the cup with Cedric, Cedric ends up being caught, and Harry is left with his final task toward his lesson in the movie. Should he save Cedric? He eventually does, and it looks as if it is the end of the movie, as Harry has learned this lesson and completed what looks like the last task in the tournament. However, when he and Cedric touch the cup, it teleports them to the location of a graveyard. The location from the beginning of the movie. The location from Harry's dreams. We know something has gone wrong, when all of a sudden, Pettigrew and Baby Voldemort come out and whack Cedric. Voldemort is then brought back. What's interesting about Voldemort is that his role in these three movies actually works as a big bad where he rises and then falls. In Prisoner of Azkaban, although he isn't in the movie, he is set up as this dark force, an evil person in the Harry Potter universe that, due to Pettigrew escaping, sets up his return. In Goblet, he actually returns, and actually has a physical fight with Harry, causing Harry to be put in a dark place, something I go into later. And finally, in Order, Harry deals with him psychologically throughout the whole movie, and in the end actually defeats him psychologically. And sure, he doesn't die, but Harry is able to defeat him psychologically, which is the focus of these three movies anyway: Harry's growth as a person. Harry luckily gets away, and we get an emotional scene of Amos Diggory crying over his son's body. Moody takes Harry away, and as Harry talks about the events, we begin to remember all the questions from the movie. We soon learn that Moody tricked Harry and everyone else into trusting him. Dumbledore and company do save him, and we get the answers to all the questions from the movie, but we were left thinking about how Harry should feel by this point in the movie. What's interesting about this movie is that it looked like our protagonist learned a lesson, but by the end he actually regresses. After Cedric's death and Moody's reveal, Harry has double-guessed all he has learned and is in a much darker place than ever before. All the progress he made through the movie of learning to trust others has gone away. Even some of the final scenes, which try to be as cheery as possible, don't have an effect on Harry. When Dumbledore comes to him in his bedroom, being a mentor figure, he tells Harry to remember that he has people near him, trying to emphasize the lesson Harry should have learned. But you can tell, Harry is not listening. Meanwhile, in the very final scene, everyone is saying goodbye, with friendship and trust being shared. But Harry walks alone, away from everyone else, not reaching out. By the end of the movie, Harry has reached the darkest place he has ever been. This perfectly sets up the next movie, as we don't want to end with our hero having lost and being left in a dark place. This goes back to our criteria of what makes a good sequel in a trilogy. Our protagonist has now been left in a very dark spot, and we as the audience want to see more, as we don't want things to end like this. The movie also has a cliffhanger with Voldemort's rise, causing a major change in the world of Harry Potter. This actually raises the stakes for the next movie. This movie worked really well as a second movie in a trilogy. It expanded the world and brought new characters into the story to interact with our protagonist. It was also left in a much darker end for our hero, as well as a cliffhanger that rose the stakes. Now, I understand this isn't a perfect movie by all means. I didn't like that the first task was too dragged out, and Dumbledore many times acted not like the mentor figure he was set up to be. But it did succeed as a sequel, and now we will take a look at how Order of the Phoenix makes a good finale. Looking at what other final movies in a trilogy did, one thing I always seem to notice that the final movie is a lot more emotional and personal than the first two. We have now stuck with our protagonist and many other side characters through two movies. We should now be both familiar with them and attached to them. In this movie, our protagonist will not only act to overcome a final obstacle, but reflect on everything from his past, which are the last two movies. He will learn a final lesson that overarches with the lessons he learned or tried to learn in the previous movies, and finally becomes the leader, mentor, hero, or whatever it was he was supposed to be. In The Dark Knight Rises, Bruce finally becomes that heroic character he was meant to be and saves Gotham, dying in the process. Sort of. In Return of the Jedi, Luke saves Vader, and they defeat the Empire and Sith. In Return of the King, Aragorn finally fulfills his destiny of being king, and Frodo completes his journey of destroying the ring. In all of these finales, the protagonist finally triumphs over the villain, becomes the person he was trying for, and learns a final lesson. Now, let's see if Order of the Phoenix does this. With Goblet of Fire ending with our protagonist at a very low point, it is important for the finale to try and re-emphasize Harry's isolation. Harry's ordeal with Cedric, Voldemort, and fake Moody caused him to lose many of the lessons he had learned in both of the previous movies. Due to that, Harry begins to lash out more due to no longer being able to control his emotions. He is very pessimistic and angry at the world instead of being hopeful. And finally, he is skeptical of trusting people, even his friends. In the beginning of the movie, we immediately see Harry's isolation emphasized, as a blog writer points out that Harry starts off, quote, watching a muggle family in a playground, end quote. Not only that, but it is a mother with her son, which really hurts Harry. Then comes Dudley, who taunts Harry about Cedric and his mother, which causes Harry to lash out and threaten him. So far, the movie has emphasized that Harry is both lonely and angry. After that, him and Dudley are attacked by Dementors, and Harry uses magic, causing him to be expelled. This makes Harry even more annoyed, as he believes he can't now return to the one place that actually brings him happiness. We also see Harry having a dream about Cedric and Voldemort, which reminds the audience as to why Harry is so depressed. Harry is then taken by some Order members, and he is given a brief amount of joy and hope with him riding on a broomstick through London. With this being the last movie in this so-called trilogy, and us being really invested in our characters by now, this final chapter actually introduces little to no new characters. The only new characters we get are Tonks and Kingsley, who play minor roles in the Order, Bellatrix, who is only in this movie to serve as another dangerous Death Eater and kill Sirius, Luna, which helps Harry with his feelings of isolation, and finally Umbridge, who serves as the villain for most of the movie at Hogwarts. This, in my opinion, is very important for a finale, as the focus should really be on the protagonist and him reflecting on the past. Due to that, this movie brings back many characters we were introduced to in the last two movies. We get the Weasleys, Lupin, Moody, Lucius, Fudge, Trelawney, Snape, Hagrid, and, most importantly, Sirius. When Harry gets to Grimmauld Place, he finally sees Ron and Hermione and goes on an angry tirade since they didn't tell him about much in their letters. We then have Harry reunite with Sirius, who he hasn't seen since Prisoner of Azkaban. Sirius and the Order then proceed to tell Harry, in an expositional manner, about the threat of Voldemort and how Fudge isn't informing the wizarding community, which are the general conflicts of the movie. However, since the movie, and this trilogy overall, is more about Harry and his psychological growth, this is fairly brief and only there in the beginning to explain the plot. Fudge's lies about Harry also add to him being distrustful and angry at the world. The movie then proceeds to get Harry to a hearing at the Ministry. This actually works, as just like the Night Bus and the Quidditch World Cup in the previous movies, it shows the wonder of the wizarding world and how it compares to the human world. At the same time, it moves the plot forward by showing the mysterious corridor to the Department of Mysteries that will come up later in the movie, as well as clears Harry of all charges so he can go to Hogwarts. Then, on the way to Hogwarts, Harry shares a close moment with Sirius as he gives Harry a gift. Sirius probably plays the most important role in Harry's development throughout these three movies. He acts as Harry's beacon of hope and his connection to both his parents and past. He's also the only character that appears only in these three movies that make up the trilogy of Harry's growth. Well, I mean, he does appear in Deathly Hallows as like a resurrected ghost thing, but not as a human. Throughout the trilogy, he is one of the major mentor figures who constantly helps Harry learn his lessons of hope, trust, friendship, and love. He learns to rely on Sirius and speaks with him about his insecurities. Sirius also helps Harry in his transition of being a leader and mentor. Anyways, we then see more of Harry's insecurities with him imagining Voldemort at the train station and his anger when he lashes out at Malfoy. We then are reintroduced to Neville, who plays a much larger role in this film, as well as Cho Chang as Harry's love interest. We also get introductions to Luna Lovegood and the Thestrals, which now make Harry more isolated from his friends, as he can't see them, but some weird girl he just met can. We then have Harry enter the Gryffindor common room, only to get weird looks and people judging him, giving him more distrust. He then lashes out at Seamus, and then Ron a bit later. Now might be a good time to mention that the thing I love the most about this movie is the editing. Through Harry's dreams and later his occlumency lessons, the movie uses quick cuts between many moments. This causes uneasiness as Harry deals with his fear of Voldemort and that affecting his view and personality. It is also a particularly clever way for the protagonist and audience to reflect on the past and everything Harry has to deal with. Just like I said before, the final movie tends to be more personal, emotional, and reflective, and the use of these quick cuts does that. I would talk about the use of quick cuts for longer, but this has already been really long, so let's just continue. We then get Umbridge's class as Harry lashes out once more and gets angry that no one seems to believe him about Voldemort's return, with him then being punished about it after. Ron and Hermione try to help him and advise him to tell Dumbledore, but he refuses and leaves. By this point, Harry's time at school, the one place he actually loves, has not been going well. Everyone seems distrustful and Harry lashes back with anger and loneliness. He responds by sending a letter to Sirius, who he trusts with his insecurities. We also see him meet with Luna, as she tells him about the Thestrals and how they are different, as well as gives Harry advice saying that he shouldn't be isolated, as Voldemort would want him to feel alone and without friends. Which brings us to the theme of the movie and the lesson Harry has to learn: love and friendship. Not only is this the theme of this movie, but it is also the theme of the overall trilogy, and the series for that matter. In the other movies, the themes were hope and trust, but the importance of friendship and love was still present in those movies. The main lesson Harry has to take away is to rely on people, and know that having love and people you care about is the best way to deal with the darkness. Both hope and trust are smaller themes within that theme, as you need them to have friendship. After Harry's conversation with Luna, he comes back and asks his friends if he can join them, which becomes one of his first steps in the movie from remission. After that, we get a montage of Umbridge taking over the school and limiting the amount of time people can spend with others. Umbridge begins to stand as the villainous character against Harry's growth and in fact the theme of friendship. She prohibits any group meetings and begins to restrict many free student liberties like Weasley products. In each of these movies, the villain seemed to always go against the theme of the movie. In Prisoner, Dementors were easily against hope as they sucked all the happiness out of people. In Goblet, Fake Moody or Crouch Jr. served against the trust theme as he was disguised the whole movie and he couldn't be trusted. Now, in Order, even though the main villains are Voldemort and the Death Eaters, Umbridge serves as the antagonist for most of the movie as she challenges Harry in the realms of friendship. After she almost sacks Trelawney, Harry, Ron, and Hermione get a message from Sirius as he tells them about the growing threats of Voldemort and how they are on their own. This causes Ron and Hermione to think of having Harry serve as a new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher. With the support of both his friends and Sirius, Harry is given the opportunity to grow as a leader and as a person. When people meet in the Hog's Head, people as usual begin to question him about what happened to Cedric, causing Harry to once again stop and doubt doing this. However, Luna comes in clutch to help him as she and other students begin to speak about all the amazing things Harry has done in the past. They speak about his ability to produce a Patronus, take on hundreds of Dementors, and go up against Voldemort. And yes, I know they mentioned the basilisk thing, and I can't really argue against that, except that they were just naming many accomplishments of Harry, so we as the audience have just got to think of it as another accomplishment from Harry's past. After Harry then convincingly is able to deliver a speech about Cedric and what happened, he receives the trust and understanding of his classmates as they begin to sign up. This finally begins to give Harry some joy and purpose. We then have him and Umbridge begin to have a silent war with each other as he expands his DA class and she posts more rules. In another montage, we begin to see how the class expands and learns. Then, towards the end, as this all begins to end for the holidays, Harry shares a very close moment with Cho and they kiss. Meanwhile, the scene after has him bonding about it with his friends. Harry finally begins to reach some high level of joy after all that has happened to him this past year. All until Harry has another dream, where Mr. Weasley is attacked in the Department of Mysteries. With him now giving into the anger and connection with Voldemort, he grows angrier, and when he sees Dumbledore and he tries to ignore Harry, Harry lashes out at him. Harry grows worried, and Dumbledore calls Snape in to teach Harry occlumency. There, Snape begins to teach Harry to control himself and resist against Voldemort invading his mind. We begin to see all of Harry's past struggles and how he has all these fears and moments which cause him pain. After that, we take a break to have Harry with the Weasleys and Sirius at Grimmauld Place. There, we see Harry separated once again from everyone as they receive presents. But once again, we are shown that these people still care about Harry as they toast to him and how he has saved Mr. Weasley's life. After, we learn a bit more about Sirius and Harry opening up to him. Fun fact, this was actually Daniel Radcliffe's favorite scene to film in the whole series, and that has mostly to do with how supportive Gary Oldman was. You could tell how genuine the chemistry is between Harry and Sirius. There, Sirius tells him about how actions define people, and to always see the light, and that he has friends and people you can trust everywhere, yada yada yada, all that, good stuff. With that in mind, Harry returns to Hogwarts and gets surprised with the return of Hagrid and Seamus also apologizing. Harry even begins teaching Patronuses, something he was taught at the very start of this trilogy. It seems as if everything is going perfectly for Harry. Again, when all of a sudden, Umbridge breaks into their room when the DA classes are practicing. Everything begins crashing down. As we learn Cho, the one person Harry was getting closer with, was the one who betrays them. Dumbledore flees, Umbridge becomes headmistress, and we see everyone getting punished for following him. Harry once again doesn't want to deal with anyone as he goes to be alone on the bridge. But Hagrid interrupts and shows Harry, Ron, and Hermione Grop. He teaches them to form a bond with him, which actually pays off later. We then see Harry continuing with his occlumency lessons, with Snape constantly telling him how he is weak. Out of rage, Harry tries to protect himself and ends up invading Snape's mind, only to find out that his father picked on Snape at school. This is very important as it gives Harry some perspective on the world and makes him reflect how much he has in his life. This all begins to get challenged once again when he gets a dream about Sirius being tortured. Believing it to be real, he acts recklessly to try to save him. However, his final roadblock is still Umbridge, and she catches him and his friends. When Snape walks in, Harry tries to make a last-ditch effort and relies on Snape by telling him about Sirius's predicament. Then Hermione and Grop are able to get rid of Umbridge, while Ron gets rid of Malfoy and his cronies. Harry begins to realize that maybe he can rely on his friends. And although he still rejects them at first, he is easily convinced otherwise by Neville, who calls him out about the meaning of Dumbledore's army. This changes Harry's attitude, as he finds meaning in those friends and love in general. Harry even gets to have a chance to fight against the Death Eaters, both with his friends and Godfather, something he wanted in the very beginning. However, just like the last movie, he is given a final test as a hero as he sees Sirius die at the hands of Bellatrix. Rage comes back to him and he immediately runs after her with the intention of killing her. As the audience, we don't want Harry to do it due to all the change he has undergone and all the obstacles he has dealt with. Harry chooses to control himself and refuses to kill her. With that, Harry has learned to control his emotions, but Voldemort still tries to find a way to test him and hurt him by getting inside his mind and exploiting all the negativity and similarities that they both share. In what is my favorite moment from the entire series, Harry sees his friends and is reminded of all the happiness in his life and all the people he has to live for. Harry is able to defeat Voldemort psychologically, catching him off guard and having him be seen by Fudge and many Ministry officials. In a way, Harry does defeat Voldemort by showing him that he is better than him by having positivity, love, and friendship. He also clears up all the controversy about him as a fame seeker and that he was telling the truth about Voldemort all along. After this climax, the movie and trilogy begin to wrap up. Dumbledore speaks to Harry, telling him that he cares so much about him and that is why he tried to keep his distance in the movie. Harry also gets some closure with Sirius after a conversation with Luna, who reassures him about how things we lose come back to us in the end, which is very similar to what Sirius told him in Prisoner, when he said he can find everyone he loves in his heart. In the final scene, he reflects one last time on the way to the train, with Ron and Hermione and many other friends near him, about how they have love and friendship, something that Voldemort doesn't have. With that, we get a last shot of Harry with his friends and Hogwarts in the background. And that concludes the movie and the trilogy. To sum up, Harry's growth was at the core of this trilogy. He started the first movie as a fearful, negative, lonely, and out-of-control teenager who by the end learned hope and controlling emotions. In Goblet of Fire, he continued his journey by learning to trust only for him to lose his progress due to difficult circumstances. Only to, in the final movie, learn everything all again and stronger than ever with love and friendship defeating the final villain of Voldemort. Along his journey, Harry was helped by his friends like Ron, Hermione, Neville, and Luna, as well as mentor figures like Lupin, Dumbledore, and Sirius. They helped him to understand how much happiness he had and even to become a mentor figure to many of his classmates. At the same time, while having a main focus on Harry, the movies introduced us to the wizarding world, with wonders like Hogwarts, the Night Bus, Quidditch World Cup, Triwizard Tournament, and Ministry of Magic, as well as with dangers like Dementors, Death Eaters, corrupt government officials, and an evil Dark Lord. Finally, the movies kept a continuous and concise story within the trilogy that was fairly easy to keep up with and contained a satisfying conclusion. These three movies really made me fall in love with Harry and the universe that surrounded him. Then again, these are just my opinions, no one has to agree with them, and although these movies weren't really a trilogy, the progression of both the story and protagonist really made me see it as a smaller trilogy within the Harry Potter franchise.